Thanks for your company today. We're taking a dive into Christian history, 20th century Christian history, what happened in Australia in the middle half of last century. And I don't know actually if you can call it history because I was alive for some of it, but Hugh Chilton has done his PhD on the topic, and he's kindly agreed to come in and answer our questions on evangelicals and the end of Christendom. Hugh, we're thinking about first, though, the pastor's heart and your personal pastor's heart, and what's God been doing on your heart?
Yeah, thanks, Dominic, and great to be with you and your audience today. So my wife and I had our third child during lockdown. It's the day after we've come out of it, but we had a baby boy.
So how old?
He is today actually. He's 2 months old.
Right.
So yeah, and we're thinking about what to name him, and we deliberated a lot about this, and we were deliberating right up into the birthing suite, if you need to know that. But we settled on the name Caleb because we think that it's going to get harder to be a Christian in the 21st and 22nd century, most probably, and it's going to need young people and old people to be wholehearted, and the name Caleb is wholehearted. And so we thought that's our prayer for him, and it's our prayer for ourselves too, that we wouldn't be conformed, but would be wholehearted and adventurous in following Jesus in the season in which he's placed us, because there's an adventure to follow there. And so I think that's the thing that we've been thinking about. I'm a teacher by day. That's my main gig, thinking about what kind of heart will young people need into the future, and how do I need to tend to my own heart for this time that God's placed me in.
Well, I mean, you've just written your PhD on evangelicals and the end of Christendom. You got a baby born into post-Christendom, and would you rather he have been born in 1960?
The music would have been better, I think. But yeah, I mean, look, I think it's naive to look back with rose-coloured glasses on the past. There are a lot of aspects of culture, of Christian culture, that I think it's good that we've moved past. I think about my own church that I'm part of in West Ryde, really diverse, multicultural, engaged in all sorts of issues. And so I think, there are a lot of great things about being alive today. I think the challenges then were probably more fixed and predictable. And I think just the flux of the environment we live in, particularly for young people, how bombarded they are by all sorts of different messages. It's a pretty hard time to grow up. But as I think I sort of make the case in the book, crises didn't develop in 2020 or 2021. We've been through these challenges before. And as I said, God calls out from his people particular responses to the crises of the day. So he is born where he's born and when he's born, and may God give him the grace to meet the hour.
So how did evangelical leaders respond to the collapse of Christendom in Australia?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think it's probably first helpful to describe just what that was. What it was.
What was the collapse?
Because we sort of assume, in our culture, and I think in our as Christians as well, that Christianity's never really had that deeper purchase on the Australian imagination. That it was probably bound up with respectability and things, but, once people could see past that, it all sort of crumbled away. But what I found, and I was quite surprised to find, was that up until the 60s, most people thought of themselves as part of a Christian nation, part of a world of Christian nations, Greater Christian Britain. They thought of themselves very unproblematically.
That was one of the big ideas I got reading your thesis, that the national identity, much, much stronger than I feel it today.
Yes, yeah. Feeling a sense of being Australian. Yeah, absolutely.
Australian as part of Britain.
As part of Britain, and as part of what you might call, a greater Christian Britain. Not so much a colony, but part of Christendom, a family of nations. And so, even if people were atheists, they very happily assented to the proposition that Australia was a Christian nation and opposed to atheistic regimes like communism. And that was held, across the political spectrum. So, you've got Labor leaders talking about this Christian country of ours. It was held across a whole lot of different different aspects of life. So the kind of moral codes, the rituals, the way people spent their time. People played in Christian sporting teams. We didn't have Sunday trading. All these sorts of markers of a Christianised culture, and that was assumed, at the end of the 50s with the Billy Graham Crusade, which is where my book begins in 59. It was just assumed that was how things would continue, that the 60s would be like the 50s but better. And so, as we know, that wasn't the case. And so the 60s, the 60s and 70s was really a period when all of those assumptions about what it meant to be Christian in Australia and what it meant to be Australian came pretty rapidly undone.
So you tackle a number of different leaders, if you like, from people like Fred Nile on the right across to the whole Jesus movement on the left, and talk about how different people respond. Just give us a bit of an overview of your take. Yeah.
Sure. So I think one of the really interesting things about exploring individuals and movements and groups of people is you see that they don't fit categories neatly. And what I found was that evangelical responses to crises really covered a broad spectrum. And so, if you wanted to sketch that out on a spectrum, on one hand, you've got people like Fred Nile, who really responded in quite a...
now, some people might not know who Fred Nile is. We're going around the world, so tell us about him.
Yeah, so he's coming up this November, 40 years almost continuously as a member of the Legislative Council in New South Wales, our upper house in our state parliament. He's called the Father of the House, and probably one of the most prominent kind of Christian conservative figures. If you wanted to equate him to somebody overseas, you might say a Jerry Falwell type, although the similarities aren't absolute.
And you actually go to some degree pains to distance from this, if you like, just taking the stereotype of America or the UK.
That's right, yeah. And again, there's that spectrum. So, being equated to stereotypes overseas isn't helpful. So you've got him at one end, and his response to particularly the moral changes of the 60s and 70s, the collapse of norms around what gets shown on TV and printed in the press and so forth is to call people to stand up and be counted, and appeal to a broader consensus than just evangelicals. So working across denominational divides and more broadly as well, to call people together to say, we don't agree with this and we want to make our voice heard. So he was involved in the Festival of Light, bringing that to Australia, and then ended up starting a political movement and elected in 1981. And so
Christian citizen was a big kind of motif for him, in particularly his early life. Yeah. And his maiden speech in Parliament as well. Yeah,
I was struck just reading that speech in 81. The most common word there isn't moral or family or values, it's citizen. And I think these people don't emerge from nowhere. He grew up in the Christian Endeavour movement, which I was surprised to discover. I hadn't heard of it at all. I'd grown up in the church, but it was this worldwide, really...
kind of like the Christian Boy Scouts or Christian Girl Scouts.
Exactly, yeah. Huge global movement begun in the 1880s in the US. Huge movement. And he grew up in that movement and ended up directing it. And it had a very strong sense of activism. If you think about one of the defining marks of evangelicalism, it's that they're active in the world, and a really strong sense of citizenly duty. That you're here to contribute to society, to speak truth to power, to cooperate, and to contribute to society. So he had that strong sense, and for him, the way of contributing was to mobilise people to take a stand against what he thought was a hijacking of the best of Australian culture, and a collapse of those moral norms.
As you described it, there were fights about no smoking, no drinking, no work on the Sabbath, and we think, well, I'm a little bit more relaxed about those things.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I think sometimes the contests and the battles, you look back and you think, was that really worth the fight over? But I also found that some of the things that Christians were at the forefront of responding to were things that you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody not opposing today. So, for instance, outlawing child pornography. There was a campaign around that, which seems startling that wasn't something that was obviously a problem. So So they're engaged in a lot of different issues, and that form, I think, of mobilisation, of protest, of political involvement is one form of response there. But as I said, there's a spectrum.
Now, you use the word in your title, evangelicals and the end of Christendom, and then you do the case study on Fred Nile and a number of the others. I mean, I don't know, is Fred Nile an evangelical?
Well, I think you'd have to ask him, and he would say he is. I interviewed him for the book about 8 years ago, but I haven't spoken to him much since. But I think his formation in Christian Endeavour and in the Methodist and in the Congregational Church and so forth, very much connected to the broader pan-evangelical movement. And I think some of those marks about, an emphasis on the cross, on the centrality of Scripture, on conversion and activism really do fit his profile. But obviously he's operating in Parliament and speaking out on a whole range of issues on which evangelicals would come to very different positions.
Yeah, I mean, I just asked because I became a Christian. Well, you say 1981 he made a speech in Parliament. I became a Christian 85, and so I'm a young man in my 20s at a university church, and hearing his statements in the public arena and not really identifying with them and feeling like culturally where I'm at as a young Christian in my 20s, he's saying quite different things. And I remember as a young journalist, I rang him up and I was able to get through because I was ringing from our media organisation. And instead of asking him for an interview, he'd just done a press conference where he said, Christians and other decent people want to stand and condemn this kind of behaviour in King's Cross. And I rang him up and said, I just didn't feel comfortable about what you said about Christians and other decent people because I'm not a decent person. I'm a sinner before the Almighty. And he just kind of shut me down and pushed me away in that conversation. Whereas I was ringing up to try and I'm on your side, I'm on your team, and first step before getting grace is getting sin. Does that fit with when you did the profile on him?
Yeah, I think he certainly saw the world in kind of almost Manichaean terms. Everything was a struggle and you had to take sides. And I think...
I kind of felt like by pointing out that I disagreed with him on sinfulness, I got put into the bad category.
Yeah, perhaps... and I think he also found perhaps a frustration when people, didn't stand up and weren't counted for some of these, on some of these moral issues, and perhaps, found that that evangelicals could focus too much on, saving souls as opposed to, saving the nation. So. Yeah, but an interesting character, remarkably successful actually. 40 years in Parliament.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's amazing. Had held the balance of power in many ways, and also interestingly enough, attracted non-Anglo supporters. I think one of the things that he said to me when I interviewed him was that a number of people who've migrated to Australia from other countries where they've been persecuted for being Christians have been his most vocal supporters because they've assumed Australia as a Christian nation and they want to get behind politicians trying to keep it so. But he's certainly, a character that evokes strong responses. And what I've been trying to say is that he's more complex, but also the whole movement is much more complex than just that particular.
Let's turn to another figure, Marcus Loane, former Anglican Archbishop of Sydney. Give us the big picture on him. Sure.
Yeah. So first Australian-born Anglican Archbishop of Sydney and in Australia, 1966 to 82. He was a pretty conservative figure in many respects, and very easy to, I think, cast on the side of all that was to be discarded about the old world. And so to be Archbishop in the 60s and in the 70s, when so much is changing around you, an interesting position to be in. But I found him to be really seriously trying to grapple with the changes taking place. If you read his presidential addresses, he's not afraid to engage with thorny issues. What I focused on with him was how he understood being Australian and being British. He had a very strong attachment to Britishness personally, and as sort of the guardian of the Protestant faith, and at the same time had a really strong concern for Australia's engagement with Asia, developing its strong sense of its purpose in the region and so forth. So again, not easily put into a box there.
What I found difficult to, not difficult, that's the wrong word, surprising, as I was reading your chapter there, I don't think the members of our church would know if I'm a monarchist or a Republican. That they wouldn't know, I don't think, because I don't think I've made statements along those lines. But you were in no doubt that Marcus Loane was a monarchist.
That's right. Yeah.
And in no doubt on a number of other issues that kind of looked back to fondness to, you didn't use the word colony, you used that kind of British Empire kind of,
Yeah. So I think he's certainly, he's a creature of his time. He wasn't actually that out of step with a lot of other clergy at the time and others in feeling a real sense of abandonment by Britain in the 60s. Interesting, the Australian newspaper, its first editorial in 1964, said that we feel as never before abandoned by our mother. The sense of Australia no longer being a British nation was a real source of crisis and of a lost identity, well beyond just the churches. So I think he was wrestling with these things in step with other people. I think he had a strong sense of, as I said, guarding that inheritance. So, for instance, in 1970, Pope Paul came, the first papal visit to Australia, and he was invited to go to an ecumenical prayer service.
It was quite a kerfuffle.
Yeah, that's right. And he just felt that he couldn't do that and be true to that Protestant heritage.
Now tell us about the reaction to that, when he said, "I'm not going to go and pray with the Pope."
Yeah, I think he received the reaction I expect you'd expect. So a lot of people viewed him as just totally out of step with the ecumenical spirit, and really focusing on things that divide rather than things that unite. It was interesting though. He was free for his.
I admire him.
Yeah, I think
justification by faith matters.
Exactly.
And Justin Welby's kind of getting it wrong, I think.
Well, there's a conviction there, and it's born of history. It was the 450th anniversary of the English martyrs, and Pope Paul had just canonised some of the Catholic martyrs. So I think he knew his history, and he knew the things that he had to hold firm on. And interestingly, though, he had a really good relationship with Cardinal Gilroy, the Catholic Archbishop. Very productive working relationship. So again, he's not a figure trying to stir up dissensions and divisions, but one who had a strong sense of conviction.
I must say I was a little gobsmacked by, and I'll read you this quote and get you to react. I welcome, this is Marcus Loane, this is your thesis, I welcome the fresh cultural influence of post-war non-British immigrants, or while I welcome the fresh cultural influence of post-war non-British immigrants, I hope that our Australian population will always have a substantial proportion of people of British descent. And I thought, my daughter's just married a young man whose Chinese parents fled Vietnam as teenage refugees, and I just was a little gobsmacked by that quote from him.
Yeah. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, yeah. And I think, that's the task of the historian, to say what shaped that view, even if you don't agree with it. And certainly, I think, he could have had views on that, but I think the trends were well and truly underway. But I think what he was getting at there, to view that sympathetically, was we need to have a strong sense of our cultural inheritance that is strong enough to absorb difference there. So I think that's probably what he would have said if pressed on that. But yeah, this was a period of so much change that was really unsettling for people.
So you've got Fred Nile kind of going to the barricades. You've got Marcus Loane longing for the crown and the British flag. And, well, over on the left, you've got the Jesus movement. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is a lot of fun. I loved, going through the archives and interviewing people like John Smith, the founder of the God Squad in Australia, John Hurt.
You talked to him?
Yeah, I did. It was a real privilege.
He's died now, I think.
He has, yeah. It was a really interesting experience. I went and met him down at his house near Geelong, and I caught the bus there and turned up all ready to go with all my questions. And he met me in the driveway in his Harley Davidson, tracksuit, and his hair down to his waist, and he's polishing his bikes, and we spent, I think, 3 hours before we got onto the conversation, and he's offering me his homebrew. Really wonderful character, and was very generous.
He wrote a book in the 80s.
Yeah.
What was that called?
Yeah, several books, but one of them was called Advance Australia.
That's
Where?
the one I read.
Yeah. And so on the left, you might assume that they were just, let's forget about this nationalist business. That's really that's looking to the past and so forth. But actually, the Jesus people were really concerned with the nation. They organised this big protest festival, music festival outside Old Parliament House in 1973 when Whitlam's elected, and they basically say this is a time of significant change in what it means to be Australian. We're excited about this, and we think that that Jesus has a place in the nation. And so the Jesus people, who I think you could say were on the left end of the spectrum there in some respects, but most of the leaders emerged from very kind of traditional evangelical stables, and what they were really interested in was how do we relate the radical claims of Jesus. They called themselves radical disciples. They wanted to go back to the radix, the root. How do we relate New Testament Christianity to the environment we find ourselves in the 60s and 70s? And nothing was off limits. They had these drop-in centre communities all over the place. West Ryde, where I live, was the first one, the House of the New World, and they'd invite Jack Mundy to come and talk about the green bands, and they'd invite the Hare Krishnas to learn more about what's going on in their movement, and they'd have these intensive seminars on the New Testament, and they were really trying to be very conscientious in relating New Testament Christianity to the challenges of the day, and yet they couldn't help but think in kind of Christian nationalist terms as well. They tried to create this, sort of a forms of worship and liturgy and so forth that were distinctively Australian. So, they had
Gum-tree theology.
Yeah, that's right, a gum leaf theology. And it's kind of, you look back at anything, it's a bit, makes you cringe a bit. But, it was conscientious. They had a conference, I think, in 1978 called Football, Kangaroos, Meat Pies, and Jesus Christ, and and they produced versions of the Psalms and prayers and things, and they had a bit of reach. 1985, the top-selling book in ABC bookshops was called "The Day the Grog Ran Out and Other Stories from the Big Book," and so they're really trying to, a bit like some of the things Kel Richards has done more recently, trying to adapt the scriptures for an Australian ear. And while a lot of it, I think, couldn't help but fall into an outdated view of what it meant to be Australian, most of us are urban and multicultural and so forth, there was something about that, that real desire to relate the New Testament to the language, the motifs, the questions of the day, and to contribute to what it meant to be Australian in a new world.
So if I go to your conclusion, what now is the place of Christianity in Australian civic culture?
Just a small question.
Just a small question.
Yeah, well, as I said, the past is my area of specialty. But look, I think that we do well to understand our history, in that the changes that we're witnessing now are rapid and unsettling, I think, for all of us in many ways. They're not new. We've been through periods of crises in the past, and the 60s and 70s, I think, is a really interesting period to learn from about the diversity of ways in which we engage with culture, and the fact that evangelicals showed up for the nation. They really cared about what it meant to be Australian. They thought that Australia had a vocation, that it mattered how we thought of ourselves together, which I think is quite admirable, and in many ways perhaps we've lost that today. I think that you had Greg Sheridan on the podcast a few weeks ago. I think he captures it nicely, that there are elements of Australian society that's Christian. A lot of the language that we use, even if we aren't aware of it, is deeply imbued with Christian, with Scripture and the kind of beliefs we have about human rights and what have you. You can't get but through the Christian story, and there are elements that are post-Christian where we're trying to actively push that aside, and there are elements that are pre-Christian where we're trying to, I work with young people, and the utter unfamiliarity with Jesus and the fascination with him, I think, presents a wonderful opportunity in this time as well. So I think, it's interesting there. And at the same time, I think, last comment on that is that I think Australia and Australians, we're also in a time of crisis where we don't really know who we are. So it's not like Christians are peculiarly afflicted with a sense of change and uncertainty. We're all, and that was the experience of the 60s and 70s. And I think because of that, and when everything's up in the air, if Christians can be clear about their distinctiveness, if they can be able to collaborate and cooperate well with others and distance themselves in other ways and be flexible about their posture, then they can actually have an influence in our society well beyond their numbers and an influence for real good in helping us think about and chart a new course for where Australia will advance into the future.
Hugh, thanks so much for coming in and sharing this with us.
My great pleasure, Dominic.
Hugh, he published this book, he published his PhD in 2014, and I read it then, and now it's available in, hard copy for only $250, soft copy for $70. But you can get a discount till the end of this month, and we'll link to that, to the place where you can buy it from on the show notes below. Thanks for joining us on The Pastor's Heart. Thanks, Hugh Chilton. He's a historian at Scots College in Sydney, and it's been great talking to him about his PhD, Evangelicals and the End of Christendom. You've been with us on The Pastor's Heart, and we will look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon.